I'm not. I'm kind of excited. It's been a while, so some grace is due, right, guys? So uh, it's good to see everybody. Happy Sunday. It's good to be back up here. It feels like this is my natural place. I may seem odd, but I've learned a lot of stuff up here. The Holy Spirit has things to say. I'm just the pencil, like Mother Teresa said. I'm just the pencil. God is the author. And it's great because, it's been, I don't even know how many weeks. But I got into this mode. I'm just going to talk about where I am right now. Okay, and I'll let you guys find your place. I'm going to speak from Job chapter 35. That's where we're going to be. So if you want to follow along, that's where we're going to go. But I've been in this place where God has challenged me to take on more responsibility. I mean, that's what I hammered you guys with it over and over and over again. And at work, I switched to where I would be more responsible for things that happen during the day rather than things that happened at night. So I figured it would be great for me to come to church more, that my days would be freed up. Well, that's the funny thing is man makes plans and yes, thank you very much. Because I found that in taking on more responsibility, it seems like you have less time to do the things that you want to do. So I've learned a lot from it, and I've got 3 brand new baby goats. If you guys didn't know that, I was raising goats too. So I've got a plate full of stuff, and I miss you guys every Sunday. Every Sunday, if I see my dad. Yesterday was the first day I went up there, and probably as long as I've not been teaching Sunday school. And Dad, he lives really far away. I don't know if you guys know. It's about 300 paces, 300 paces. Sometimes, I'll just meet him halfway in the yard, the mowers meet, right? So that's how far away we live. But time has been, sure, I'll bring him. Bye. No, I'm just kidding. They're hard to load on the back of a motorcycle, but yeah, there's no room for baby goats on the motorcycle. I'd tie them all together. It'd be a mess. Okay? But I did that. I bought the goats because I needed to learn the lesson about separating sheep from goats, and I had no idea about goats. So I've learned a lot about goats. Next is sheep, and my wife is like, you better learn more about goats before you get sheep. And I was like, well, just do like everything else and just dive right in, because that's what I do. That's the way that I learn. I don't know if other people are apprehensive and they got to lay out everything and understand everything first before they go into something to actually learn it. But every time I try to do that, I fail. And whenever I go, okay, here's the situation, it's got to happen, that's when I learn. When we're thrown into that situation. It's kind of why I picked the book of Job today. So in leading up to this, it's one of my favorite books. If you guys didn't know that. Job, Ecclesiastes, Psalms, the wisdom literature is some of my favorite. Job chapter 35. And I'm skipping a whole lot of good content here, but this is one of the hardest books to get through. Has anyone ever struggled through Job? I have. I'll give you a little hint. Job in our Bible is placed before the Psalms, but you have to understand the Psalms before you can go back to Job. And you have to understand Ecclesiastes and Proverbs before you can get to Job. Because if I was to paint a picture and tell you what these books were, if you go to Proverbs, Proverbs is like a mother. That's how it's explained in the opening of Proverbs. It's like, listen, my wise children, or listen, my children, to wisdom, and all the things that she has to say. And then it goes on to tell you those little quips, right? Those little quotes. One of my favorite is one that Abraham Lincoln quoted from the book of Proverbs, and he says, Abraham Lincoln paraphrased Proverbs, but in Proverbs it says, it is better to keep your mouth closed and let everyone think you're a fool than it is to open it and prove them all right. And that's coming from the guy who's about to speak for 45 minutes to an hour. Okay, so that's funny irony. You can laugh right there. Because when we get into Job, there's not going to be a whole lot of laughter. I might try to throw some in there, just because that's how I defer uncomfortableness is with laughter. In the book of Job, it starts out, right, like every other book. No, not at all, right? You're immediately taken up to this space that nobody's ever been, and there's an argument and a confrontation between two characters who, if you were just looking at it with fresh eyes, you don't know who these two characters are. Up to this point, you know that the one character is the one who led the people out of Israel, and the other character is the one who seems like the bad guy in the story. So the bad guy challenges the good guy, and the good guy says, okay, go ahead. So Job is brought through all this turmoil, and every time the adversary turns the volume up a little bit more, he's like boiling a frog, and he's trying to get Job to deny God. And Job goes through every imaginable suffering that we could possibly imagine. His health goes, his family goes, he loses every material possession that he has, and even his own wife turns against him. He is alone. And then here comes three friends, right? And what a help those three friends are. And these three friends tell him, Job, you've had to do something wrong along the way. You did something. No, I haven't done anything. If I had, then bring all this more on me. Grind me back into the dust. The reason this book is so hard, I think, in part to understand, is because it's written in Hebrew polemic form. It's poetry, right? Like, anyone ever read the prophets and go, I totally got everything that he's talking about? It's hard to. The Psalms is a starting point into poetry and understanding it. Because poetry always speaks from an emotional basis. And it's hard to translate an emotion that a person has into black and white paper. I mean, have you ever tried, when you were angry, tried to write a letter and then read it afterwards? Or when you were super happy, tried to write a letter and then read it afterwards? Because you don't speak the language of emotions. It's hard to get those two parts of your brain to talk together. So Job is on this emotional roller coaster, up and down. 1 second he praises, and the next second he curses the day that he was born. 1 second he praises, and the next second he curses the ground that he's standing on. He curses the house, and even the things that he had been given. He says it's better for me to not even have them and to lose them than to not have them, or to not have them at all than it is to have them and lose them. He says those things are better. And Job goes on and on and on, and his friends go on and on and on. And they just keep hammering him with their emotions and the way that they feel. And Job comes back with the things that he feels. And the whole time he's scraping his skin with the broken pottery in the ashes of his house, weeping the loss of his children, his crops, his livestock, even his own wife turning against him. And this is the deepest book of wisdom because, well, we all want that one question answered, don't we? Why do good people suffer? Because for all intents and purposes, Job is considered the best person on the planet. That's what God says. Have you seen my servant Job? Have you seen him? I equate it to, a lot of times, it's like a thief walks into a jewelry store, and the jeweler says, well, what are you here to do? Well, steal, kill, and destroy. Have you seen the most beautiful diamond that I have? That's how God responds to this adversary. Now, if you were just to open a story like that, like how many questions flood your head? Like what kind of person would do that? What kind of people would worship a God who does that? Well, Job seeks to answer that question, not the one about why good people suffer, because we all want the answer to that question. It's just not here. It kind of explains it, but doesn't answer it. So, chapter 35. Everybody's got your place. I'm going to read it, and then we'll pray, and then we're going to explore some ideas here. So this is Elihu. Now you have three characters who are his friends, and they're terrible people. And this mysterious character pops in out of nowhere, and he starts talking. And this is after his first After his first movement, he goes into his second movement, and he's starting to address the things that Job has said. Okay? So, Elihu answered and said, "Do you think this to be just? Do you say, it is my right before God that you ask, what advantage have I? How am I better off than if I had sinned? I will answer you and your friends with you. Look at the heavens and see, and behold the clouds, which are higher than you. If you have sinned, what do you accomplish against him? And if your transgressions are multiplied, what do you do to him? If you are righteous, what do you give to him? Or what does he receive from your hand? Your wickedness concerns a man like yourself, and your righteousness a son of man. Because of the multitude of oppressions, people cry out. They call for help because of the arm of the mighty. But none says, where is God, my maker, who gives songs in the night, who teaches us more than the beasts of the earth, and makes us wiser than the birds of the heavens. There they cry out, but he does not answer, because of the pride of evil men. Surely God does not hear an empty cry, nor does the Almighty regard it. How much less when you say that you do not see him, that the cause is before him, and you are waiting for him. And now, because his anger does not punish, and he does not take much note of transgression, Job opens his mouth in empty talk, and he multiplies his words without knowledge. So Elihu is a strange character in this story. And if you read the things that Elihu has to say, they actually make sense. And I often think of Elihu like John the Baptist, okay? Because there's all this jesting going on. There's two parties, Job and his friends, and they're having these arguments back and forth. You did something wrong, Job. You had to have done something wrong. God's just. Why would he punish someone who doesn't deserve to be punished? It doesn't make sense to them, so they're making the argument from their standpoint. God only blesses. He doesn't curse. Now, I know that there's a lot of churches that teach that if you're struggling with something or you're having a hard time or you're suffering, guess what? It's not from God. But sometimes it is. And we have to wrestle with that idea. So here's this character, Elihu, who comes along. He's not a friend of Job. He's just this young guy who pops into the picture like John the Baptist, and he talks about how, well, wait a second. Well, what does he say? Do you think this to be just? How does he open his statement? With a question, doesn't he? Now, of the things I know, of me reading the New Testament, Jesus often opens his statements with what? Questions. Why? Well, okay, hold your thought for 1 second. Hold your thought for 1 second, because I'm going to try to poke more thoughts out of that. I heard something very wise the other day, and it kind of stuck in my head, and I've been thinking about this over and over and over again. You ever have one of those thoughts that you just can't get out of your head? We all think of humility as like the person who, they don't talk that much and they don't say those things. And I used to always make that joke that Moses, in the book of Exodus, he says, I'm the most humble guy in the world, doesn't he? And it seems like a contradiction unless you understand what humility really is, right? Okay, so we think that humility is the guy who sits in the back, the guy who, he doesn't brag about the things that he's done or his accomplishments. Job never does. He's humble. That's what it says. Job is a humble man. He's the most righteous among all in his generation. Well, humility actually comes, the quote is, let me just get it out. Let me spit it out there. The quote is that humility, to define it, is when you make the things that you don't know more important than the things that you do. Now think about that for a second. Because how many of us, I mean, come on, I'm getting gray too, so I'm in the same club, okay? And I'm losing my hair as well. So I'm getting there. As I age, I notice certain things, like when my kids will say something to me, and I say, no, you're wrong, because I know that I'm right. Does anyone ever do that? Anyone guilty of that? Or you'll come across a stranger, I'm right, and I know that you're wrong. Where are you acting from? A position of humility or a position of pride? Because that's the opposite, isn't it? We act from a position of pride, especially with the current debate going on right now. I don't know if anybody's involved in that. The Roe versus Wade thing, yay, they may overturn it, and Tennessee has trigger laws, that's great. And the thing with those two parties arguing back and forth is whenever there's an argument between two groups of people, now given I'm pro-life, I think that any time you take a baby in the womb, it is evil, because the only way to do it would be selfish. But at the same time, I have to act from a point of humility. So I have to listen to the other side's argument. Okay? I have to listen to them and actually find the root cause of why they think the way that they do and make an argument on their behalf in order to back up what they have. It's called the steel man argument. If I can make your case better than you can, and I don't think that your case is right, then how much stronger is my case to make? Okay, so why did I get into this? I just wanted to talk about Job and humility. Okay, we're going to go this direction, all right? Because that's the way God's pushing me, all right? So when I make the argument and I say anytime you kill a single cell, a clump of cells, or a whole human being, it's still killing. It's still murder, no matter how you cut that. No matter how you slice that bread, it's still murder. And then they make the argument back that it's just a clump of cells. They try to make it insignificant and tiny as possible. They try to make it as small as they possibly can to justify what they're doing. And that's what I thought that they were doing for the longest time. And then I realized something the other day. I said, Western society, all of Western society is based on the establishment that every individual is sovereign in and of themselves. And do you guys know where that idea comes from? It's not from Eastern philosophy. It's not from a Russian philosopher somewhere or a Chinese philosopher somewhere. It's from the very first page, depending on the print size, of your Bible. God made them, well, chapter 2, God made them male and female in His own image. That means every single person is responsible for every choice that they make. So the people who are arguing choice are saying, this is what they're saying in essence. They're saying, because God made that person, they have the right to choose what they can and cannot do with their own body. That's the pro-choice argument. At the root of it, that's what it is. And the pro-life argument is that God made that baby sovereign, and it has the right to live. We're arguing the same thing, but just from different angles. Because someone values the adult, and someone values the baby. Someone values potential, and someone values potential that's been achieved. And the only thing we're arguing back and forth on is what? It's happenstance. Because who's more important? If you take the mother away from the baby, what do you got? If you take the baby away from the mother, you just have a woman. So the argument that everyone's getting all emotional about is the same argument from two different sides. Now, I'm not saying I would ever condone anyone to ever. I would talk anyone I could out of it because I believe that that baby is individually sovereign. And the people who are arguing on the other side are claiming that that woman is individually sovereign. And I believe that too. I believe she has the right to make mistakes. But I don't think that any one of us should condone anyone taking anyone else's life ever. Whether it be in Ukraine or whether it be in a hospital. Doctors are supposed to protect life, not take it. So with that said, I've made a lot of good points and talked a lot of people away from that edge. And the thing is, we always try to make these arguments from the standpoint of I know that I'm right, rather than you may have something valuable to say to me. So all these people with blue hair and the people who are burning down clinics and all that, you know what, underneath their argument, they have a foundational belief in who? And they don't even realize it. They don't even know it. You say, you know who gave her the right to choose? Because go to a communist country. What choice do you have? You don't have one. If it's China, I know that they've ended the one-child policy, but did you have a choice? Uh-oh. What are we going to do now? Well, we don't have to worry about it because the government makes the choice for us, don't they? That's the thing about tyranny, isn't it? They get to make the choice for you. Most of us are happy with tyranny. I mean, we say that we're not, but you know, the easiest way to tell if you're happy with tyranny or not, whose fault is your current situation? If it's somebody else's, if it's because of the high gas prices, or it's because of the war in Ukraine, or it's because the president, or it's because of the Congress, guess who's happy with tyranny? You are, because you've just blamed everybody else. The moment you start to blame everybody else for the problems that you have, guess what you've done? Self-imposed tyranny. I don't know if you guys know Solzhenitsyn. He was a Russian. He wrote The Gulag Archipelago. Interesting guy. I still haven't finished those books, even though every free moment I get, I've got them on my phone. So if you guys see me walking around at Food City or something and my head's buried in my phone, you know that I'm reading volume 3 of The Gulag Archipelago. Everyone should read it. But his story in life was that he went through I see it now, okay. They're going to tie right back together. Job and all this stuff is going to tie right back together through Solzhenitsyn. So Solzhenitsyn was a soldier in World War II. He fought on the Eastern Front. If you've read any stories about the Eastern Front and how terrible that was, it was the epitome of human suffering. He saw it every day. He fought on the Eastern Front. He survived. By some kind of miracle, he survived. Just soldiers that the Russians lost on the Eastern Front is unbelievable. Just the amount of life that was just thrown into machine guns until basically Stalin's idea, his whole battle strategy is if we throw enough bodies at them, they'll run out of bullets. That was his strategy. 100 million on the Eastern Front just died. Like, we think that our losses were bad. One battle on the Eastern Front, the Russians lost more fathers, brothers, dads than all of us together combined. That's the United States, France, Britain, any other country that was in the war. One battle the Russians lost had more casualties than we had in the entire war. So he survived that. And the moment he got out, he survived what you would say was the most unsufferable thing in life. He was thrown into the Gulag, a prison, because people saw him as some kind of hero, because he survived. If you survived the war and you weren't working in a factory, you were a hero. So Stalin had a policy where if you survived the war and you didn't, kiss the ring, he would throw you in prison where you were sent to die, where most people who went to those prisons died. And as he's sitting in prison for the better part of 10 years, he has everyone to blame in the world for his situation in life. Why he was raised an orphan, why he had to go fight Hitler. He had the two best scapegoats in history to blame for everything. And he came to the realization that his current situation was probably his fault. So in order to atone for the things that he thought he may have done, he wrote the Gulag Archipelago. And, everyone says that Reagan was the one that toppled the Soviet Union. It was the Gulag Archipelago that toppled the Soviet Union. It was one man who decided to take responsibility for the suffering that he had faced his entire life, brought down an entire tyranny of a nation. One of the biggest tyrants we've ever known. I mean, if you compare the landmass of Russia and the countries that they conquered, the Soviet Union, let me rephrase that, because we do have that thing going on right now in Ukraine. It was one of the largest empires ever built. It just happened in 10 years. I mean, Russia just took everything, the Soviet Union, sorry, I keep misspeaking here. They just took everything that was in their path and absorbed it into the collective. And when they did that, they took anybody who was of value, right? Just like the Khmer Rouge did, just like every other communist country does. Anybody who had education or anybody who had any kind of wealth, they rounded them up and either exterminated them or put them in prison camps. Because clearly, they don't value the sovereignty of the individual, right? Only Western countries do that. We look at a homeless person, I mean, if you're decent at all, any kind of ethics, you look at a homeless person, you don't go, oh, we should just throw that person in a gas chamber. We don't do that. That's an Eastern philosophy. Because your value is intrinsic. Doesn't matter what you've done, God created you sovereign. Because God is sovereign and you're made in his image, you're sovereign. So Solzhenitsyn, through his suffering, found his meaning and purpose. He found who he was supposed to be out of the very thing that he thought would kill him. So, with that said, Job, we always want to answer that question, why do we suffer? Don't we? We always want to answer that, like, why am I suffering right now? Take this away. Take my suffering away. But I tell you what, the greatest people that we've known in history were the ones who decided to face their own suffering and take responsibility for it. Because I tell you what, there's all kinds of stuff that we hide from every day because we're afraid of them. Everyone's afraid to suffer. At first, you don't want to be uncomfortable. You're like, I don't want to be uncomfortable. But then you get over that uncomfortableness, and then it starts to become hard. The more relationships you develop, the more responsibilities you develop, the more that you suffer. So here's God, and he lays all this suffering on Job, and Job wants to know why. And Elihu responds to him, why do you want to know why? God's just. Why can't you just have faith in him? Have you guys ever heard that before? Like you've lost somebody that you cared about? Like last year, there was a lot of loss. And this year, I don't know what it brings. There's people who are even afraid of tomorrow because they don't know what that's going to bring. I know Jesus said, don't worry about tomorrow, right? When has worrying ever added a single day to your life? See, that's the beauty of Jesus, is that you don't know what's adding or taking away from the days of your life. So when he says it, he means it, and what he's doing is like a little joke, right? Because Jesus has a great sense of humor, guys. Trust me. I'm living proof, okay? So Jesus has a great sense of humor. I'm living proof. Because when he says that, I'm just thinking funny. I'm in the book of Job, and I'm telling jokes with Jesus. So when he says that you can't add a single day to your life, how would you ever know if you added a day or took one away? You don't. So why are you even worrying about it in the first place, right? So like, Jesus is a hilarious guy. He's funny. When you see the character that he is, it's great. So when Elihu starts throwing these things at him, he's like, he's like throwing them in the forms of questions. And I don't hear Elihu here. You know who I hear? The one who wrote the book in the first place, right? Because who's about to show up? Elihu reminds me of John the Baptist in the fact that he answers the question, or he opens with questions, and he ends with questions, and he throws out all these questions everywhere. And you're just like left with this huge empty bag of stuff. It's like, well, what do I really know? And you reevaluate your situation. And then God shows up in a couple chapters after Elihu brings mighty praise. 2 chapters of praise follow this that Elihu throws out. I encourage you to read them because they're really good. That's what I did all morning. I was back and forth between Luke chapter 17 and I just kept getting pulled back into Job. But Job, here's Job, and he's listening to this young guy because Elihu's a young guy. He's like, I didn't speak, right? If you just back up 1 chapter, I'm encouraging you guys to read the book of Job. Encouraging, because it does give you courage. So if you back up 1 chapter, Elihu is the only one who listened to the proverb that says, don't speak. If you're foolish, remain silent and let everyone think you're a fool, then open your mouth and prove them all right? He does that because the whole time you don't know if he's sitting there in the room while they're all talking, blathering on like a bunch of old men do, right? Like sitting in the barber shop and just talking about stuff that doesn't matter. He's quiet. He's the young guy, and he sits there and he listens, and he's like thinking, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. And then when he lays out his case, guess who shows up? In 2 chapters, God himself shows up. In a whirlwind, with his voice thundering. In all the ways that Elihu described him, he shows up. And Job is just sitting there like, I don't know what he's thinking. I can only imagine what I would be thinking in that moment. Like, uh-oh. Right? Because here's this huge, it's like a tornado with lightning coming out of it. And it shows up and it starts talking to you. And what do? Like, get up. Pull your pants up. Let's get ready for a conversation, Job. I'm just paraphrasing God there. But that's the gist of what he says. He says, pull your pants up, get your good clothes on, we're going to talk. And then Job's like, okay, because Job's just spent 30 odd chapters accusing God of being unjust, right? Up and down. 1 second, God's awesome. The next second, why would he even do this? Why did he even bring me into the world? Okay? And then when God shows up, God starts saying, what? Come on, guys, it's beautiful. Because it's the same thing Jesus says. He starts every statement with what? A question. Why is that? Because God's humble, isn't he? Because why would I ever, here's the almighty creator of the universe. He knows where the goats have their babies. That comes up too. I encourage you to read it. He knows what holds back the tides. Everything that you don't know, he knows, and he just showed up. He just showed up. He's there in the picture. And what does he have to say? Does he answer why Job is suffering? Nope. God showed up, though. Does he answer, why he took away this and that? Or why I don't have my Corvette or my Porsche, or why the good old days are gone? God never answers that. He doesn't even really answer the questions that he poses to Job because they're said in jest, right? Like he says, do you know how the snowflakes form in the heavens? Do you know that, Job? All that Job knows right now is that he's lost everything that he had. So God shows up in this whirlwind after this mysterious character Elihu spends 1 chapter asking Job questions and another chapter praising God and talking about all the awesome stuff that God does. And Job is the only character that actually gets to see God. Isn't he? Think of that, because if you skip to the back, Job, he doesn't have any answers, does he? Because Job just thought he was humble. And the relationship that he had with God, he gives you the clue of why this all happened in the first place, why he went through all this stuff. Because when Job finally does respond to God, he says, basically, I don't know anything. I had heard of you, but now I see you. That's his response to God. I had heard of you, but now I see you. Because there's a difference in hearing what someone says and being in a relationship with who they are. See, so the story starts out, Job commits all the sacrifices he's supposed to do. He does this, he does that, he follows all the rules. He's righteous, right? But to him, like I always say, if you examine the relationship, God is this far off, distant character that I've got to do these things for because he's bigger than I am and he could smash me at any moment. This is the final book of wisdom. And I think a lot of us, it takes us a long time to get there. Because the fear of God is not so much being afraid that he's going to smash me into dust. The fear of God is the look on his face when he shows up. When I see it. How is it going to be? What have I done? See, because true belief in somebody or something is not what we try to project it as. Like people all the time, they say that question, oh, you're a believer. You know what my favorite response is? How could I ever say that? I could never say that I'm a believer, because to say that would be to imply that I follow everything that he does, that I am just as good as he is, that we're on equal footing. See, no. To believe would mean that me and him are on the same level. See, no. I live my life as though there is a God in heaven who cares about me, and I fear disappointing him. Because I know who he is, and I know how awesome he is. Oh, come on. How many chapters do you need of things that you don't know before you realize that God's the one in control? Because that's what we do a lot of times, is we start arguing this point or that point, and we get lost in the weeds. And the adversary is always trying to get us caught in the weeds. And if you don't believe that, then you haven't read about the serpent in the garden. Because that's what he does. He promises us things that we already have in order to get us to focus on things that don't matter. Because each one of us is intrinsically valuable. Why? Because he said so. And we heard it. Just like Job, we all heard it. And we all may be walking our lives in a way, that we seek to do all the things right that he said to do right. But that doesn't mean that you're in a relationship with that person. Just because I've heard the president's name does not mean that he knows mine. Just because I do everything the president said that we're supposed to do, right? It's hard to do that in a society like ours, because most people don't agree with the president, or they're like, I do this or that. The best example I can give you is tyranny. The best example I can give you is a tyrannical government. Just because you do everything that Chairman Mao told you to do does not mean that Chairman Mao cares about you. It does not mean that Chairman Mao knows your name. So you did all the stuff you were supposed to do. Jesus says in Luke, okay, now I know why I was reading Luke. So Jesus says in Luke that a servant, if he goes out and he does all his chores, if he's plowing in the field, he opens it with a question. Okay, so he says, do you, right? Like Jesus, he's great. Do you, if you have a servant working in the field, when he finishes his job, do you welcome him into the house and give him all kinds of rewards and treasures? It's like, no, you don't. You tell him to fix you dinner, and you have him serve it to you. Why? Why do you do that? Why does any of us do that? Well, because you did your duty. Congratulations. Duty is its own reward. I think a lot of times we get caught up and we think that we're making the right decisions. Yeah. What do you expect? More stuff for doing the right decisions? For making the right decisions? And doing the things that you were asked to do? Fulfilling your duty and obligation? No. You don't get a reward for that. The only reward is that He knows you. And when I think about it, when I really think about it, what is it that we really need in order to survive and thrive? Because suffering has a tendency to push us into these things, doesn't it? You want to know who really loves you? Get sick. Get sick. You'll find out real quick who really cares about you, who puts you on their prayer list, who really loves you. Is that not a practical example? Like, we shun suffering, don't we? We try to run from it. You know who runs from suffering? Animals. Humans are different. Suffering is the very way we find our meaning and purpose. And our God is awesome in the fact that He suffered for us, because of us. When you think about the responsibility that Jesus ultimately took on, it was every one of us and every mistake that we're going to make. And because of that, we know that God loves us. So, the responsibilities we take on, here's another story, okay. The responsibilities we take on are what defines us. And those responsibilities ultimately cause us to suffer. So I don't blame my kids, my teenagers, for not wanting to take on responsibility, right? So if I say to them, you're going to mow the yard every Friday. Oh, Dad, I've got other stuff that I've got to do, and excuse, right? I don't blame my children for not wanting to take on responsibility, because guess what? We all know from a very young age that the more things we become responsible for, the more we suffer. And my children are young, so they think like animals do. Maximum pleasure, minimum pain, right? So they do. We have a tendency to do it too. Paul has a special word for it. It's called carnal thinking. That's what he calls it. But that's what it is. When you think like an animal, that's what you do. Like, I'm raising goats now, right? Like, I've already mentioned that once. But if you want a goat to do what you want it to do, there's two ways to do it. You offer it food, maximum pleasure, or you offer it the electric fence, pain, right? I hold goats in a pen with a piece of string, probably that big around. My dad can attest to that. Goats in a pen with a piece of string that big around that gives them a little tiny shock if they touch it with their nose. And they're afraid of it. They stay away from it. They don't get near it. They don't want anything to do with it at all, because they're goats. They are carnal-minded creatures. That's the way that they think. They think, oh, that hurt. I'm going to go over here and eat the yummy food that weird two-legged creature brought me, okay? That's what they do. That's the way that goats think. I'm starting to get into their heads, okay? They are funny. They say money can't buy happiness, but it can buy goats, and that's pretty close, right? So that's another little joke. I'm telling jokes in the book of Job. So anyway, so Job goes through this. God shows up, and He doesn't reveal why. Like, Job never knows. Job doesn't read his own story. Like, nobody writes it down and they're like, hey, Job, you should see this. Can you sign off on this so we can get it published by Westinghouse? No, that doesn't happen. Job lived it. He's like, I don't want to read it, okay? I remember that. I don't want to go through it again. I remember what the electric fence felt like. No, I'm pretty sure Job's not a carnal thinker. So God does all this. He asks him all these questions. He just throws all this stuff out, and Job is like in ashes. Just like, he's like a little kid. I always think of Job as like a 8-year-old child who just hurt his knee. Okay, now hear me out on this one, because Job isn't an 8-year-old child. The story doesn't paint him as an 8-year-old child, but when I think of Job, I think of him as an 8-year-old child who hurt his knee. Now, I know it's been a long time, but does anyone remember when they were really little and they hurt themselves? What did mom do? Did she take your knee apart, reassemble it, put it back together? Did she give you some wise words of wisdom so that you could get through that the first time you felt some serious pain in your life? Did she do that? Or did she kiss you on the forehead and tell you that everything was going to be all right and it was enough for you? I wonder, at which point in my own life did I let that not be enough? Because that's essentially what God does to Job, doesn't he? As Job's griping and complaining and all that stuff, Dad shows up. And Dad always has a different approach than Mom, doesn't he? As a dad, I do have a different approach. I usually say, suck it up. It's going to be all right. And then I'm like, my dad did the same thing to me. I'm turning into my own father. But it's all right. There's 2 ligaments holding the leg on. You're fine. Okay? Don't worry. It'll heal. Just go get your mom, right? Like, that's what we do as dads sometimes, to my regret. But here's Job, and he's torn to pieces. Quite literally torn to pieces. Emotionally, spiritually. He feels like God has turned his back on him. And God shows up and he says, Job, you're not the one who pays the light bill, right? When was the last time you took out the garbage, Job? Are you the one who told the pond where it should be? I'm just trying to make analogies between a father and a son, because that's the way God is talking to Job as an old man. And we forget that somewhere along the point in our life, we start to face things that are really challenging, because you've already faced the stuff that was easy, haven't you? You've already got the boo-boo on your knee. See, most of you, when you get a boo-boo on your knee, now you don't go running to your mom for reassurance, do you? I mean, I don't. That's my mom. She probably misses that, but she probably misses the ability to show that affection. But sometimes bad things happen. Where do we run to? Well, Elihu kind of lays it out. Does God hear the wicked? Like, if you sinned, if you were just, Job says, how much better off am I? At one point in the story, okay, I know I'm long-winded and I'm running out of time here. At one point in the story, Job says, if I was a sinner, I'd be treated exactly the same way. I'm paraphrasing Job because he says it in a poetic way, and I'm not as poetic as Job is, or the author of the book of Job. But that's what he says. And then Elihu, he says, what are you talking about? God grinds the wicked into dust. You're out of your mind, Job. You've lost it. And here's this character, Elihu, like, dude, God judges those people. You don't know the mind of God. And then God shows up and says, you have no clue, right? God shows up, levies the questions, and Job is just, his mind's blown. And I think a lot of times we take what we think that we know and we make that more important than the things that we don't know. Because this is a perfect example of that. And we forget who's actually in control of the story. I don't care if it's a boo-boo on your knee, because we kind of, it seems diminished, and I did that on purpose. I diminished that on purpose. Because we all know pain. We all know suffering. And as we move through life, does pain and suffering get easier? I have a feeling it doesn't. It can embitter us, can't it? It can turn us bitter. It can change us into different people. But if you know your dad, he shows up. He doesn't take the boo-boo away, but how much more valuable is it to know that Dad's there with you in your suffering than it is to face it alone, like Job thought he was doing with his friends that were so awesome. Because how we suffer is how people see us. The biggest movement in the church is always under persecution. You know why? Because when we suffer, we do it well. You know what the Romans wrote about as they fed Christians to the lions? They bragged about it. They wrote stories. There's stories that still exist, and there's so much lost from the Roman Empire. They wrote stories about how when they fed Christians to hungry lions, how well they died. They looked at death and they said, okay. They said no other people died like that. It was amazing to them. You know where our modern church was born out of? Do you think it was through some great evangelistic movement in Rome? Or do you think it was the suffering of the early church? Because when you see another person who's going through extreme pain, and you empathize with them and you have compassion with them, and they're suffering greatly, when you see that person, your immediate question is, how can you keep a smile on your face when God has done all these things to you? How can you be happy in the midst of all this pain? The answer is easy, isn't it? It's Job. Because Jesus. I know he suffered way more than I ever could. I know he took on my burdens greater than I ever could. And because of that, I know how to suffer well. Because I got these two examples. I've got Jesus and I've got Job. Because he was able, he was willing. Do you think in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus was like, great, finally, right? No, that's not how it reads, does it? It doesn't read that way. Because he knew what was going to happen. Think about it. He was betrayed by his people. He was crushed by a tyrant. They would rather him be executed than a person who deserved it. It's the biggest tragedy ever written. The only perfect man to ever walk the earth, we killed him in the most horrific way we could imagine. We did that. But he walked up there willingly. Why? Because he loves us. That's the story. So when we face suffering, it's not a question of why good people suffer. It's a question of what good is God going to bring from my suffering? Because you have this entire poetic book of Job. The only other guy that I know, the only guy that suffered almost as much as Jesus did. And when you think about it, Nelson Mandela, you think about these people who've made names for themselves. You know how they did it? They accepted responsibility for their own suffering so they could alleviate the suffering of those around them. They took on the burden so that they could be restored. Because, Nelson Mandela was a terrible human being, but when it came to his people, he loved them, so what was he willing to go through? Because it's love ultimately that drives us. So, I know I kind of chewed into the fellowship time and the question and answer time. But that's one thing that we do that I think is a huge mistake. And we do it out of a point of pride, is because we think we know better. We think if God could just take this pain away from me, I would be a different person. If God could just do this or do that for me, I would be completely different. It's not true. Because the reality is that the only thing that's going to make you into a different person is taking responsibility for the things that you've done. And when you take responsibility for those things that you've done, guess what? Just like Solzhenitsyn, you're going to move into suffering. And when you suffer, people will watch you. And when those people watch you, it might be enough to topple the largest tyrannical government the 20th century ever seen. Or it might be enough to restore your community or your family. And I'll end with this one little story that I heard this morning as I was just digging through human suffering and pain. There was a priest, and I know, not everybody likes Catholics. I love Catholics. They're my brothers, they just see things a little bit differently. They're more, what would you call that? Functional? Not functional. They're more, I don't know. They're just different than we are, okay? So they're different than we are. They're more Romanesque. I don't know. So anyway, there's a priest, and he was working in Mumbai. And he had his little parsonage there. And He had developed Lou Gehrig's disease, and his church was always half full. And he had Lou Gehrig's disease, and I don't know if anyone's confronted Lou Gehrig's disease. I watched my best friend's mom slowly die of it. It is horrific. It is terrible. One of the worst things I've seen in my personal life. But your muscles start to atrophy from the inside of your body, and they start to die. And what was a healthy, strong, farming, tough lady, all of a sudden she's in a wheelchair. And then she goes from the wheelchair to a bed. And then she goes from a bed to not being able to speak. And then she goes from not being able to speak to no longer with us. And it happened so quick. But this priest, he developed Lou Gehrig's disease. I might run over a little bit. Are you guys okay with that? Okay, they may have to stay out there for a minute. I can see them. They're trying to break in the gates, right? The kingdom of heaven is like sheep at the gate. Okay, anyway. So, he's suffering Lou Gehrig's disease, and it's unimaginably painful. I mean, that's what his mother did almost all the time, was just scream. That's all that she could get out was screams. And in between the screams she was thirsty or hungry. But this priest kept on priesting, being a priest. Okay, I don't know what they call it in the Catholic Church. But he kept on, and he saw that all of a sudden his congregation went from half showing up to church to full every day. You know why? They're watching him suffer, seeing how true he was to his belief. When they saw how well he suffered, maybe it changed him. Because when we can see that someone's not afraid of death, guess what? That's a person to look up to. But the guy who told the story said that they were praying for his Lou Gehrig's disease when he first got down to Mumbai. And he says that he didn't know whether to be ashamed of it or not, but as the priest was telling him the story, he started to pray a different prayer. He started to pray that God wouldn't take away his Lou Gehrig's disease because of all the people that were coming into the church. Because our suffering is ultimately the place where we change people's lives. Because whose suffering was it that changed ours? And every time someone gives that message of, you don't have to suffer, it's like, where are you getting that from? Because it's not in my book. Everybody who God has called had to. Because that's ultimately where we find our meaning and purpose. Think Joshua had it easy? Nope. You think he went through turmoil? How about Moses? He ran as far away as he could from what he knew he had to do. And God called him back to it. And begrudgingly, Moses became the leader he was supposed to be. God dragged him the whole time by his shirt collar. Grabbed a hold of his collar and said, nope, come on, let's go. Here's a stick, and when you pull your hand out of your cloak, it's going to do this, and that's all you need. You think Moses the whole time was like, yeah, this is a great idea. Absolutely. In faith, I move everywhere I go. No, all of our lives are a journey, and each suffering that we face is what defines us for the next one. Amen? So I'll end with a word of prayer, and then you'll have a couple minutes to throw questions at me if you want. If you don't, I take vegetables too. You can throw vegetables at me or rocks. It's fine. Heavenly Father, I thank you for gathering